Good morning, Mr. Kolb. Ah, there you are. Uh, do we have a good connection? Can you hear me? Can you see me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you now, Timon. How
Ah,
are
good.
you? Aloha.
Aloha. Nice. The sun is shining in your place. How's Hawaii?
A little bit, a little bit. We've had a lot of rain.
A lot of rain. All right. So is it the rainy season right now in Hawaii?
Yes, it is. So everything is growing.
Okay, I can see it in the back. Well, um, nice to meet you here online, and uh, I sent you the interview question, so you know the purpose of the interview to inspire my readers, to get to know the man behind um, the learning cycles and the learning styles, which are widely used in the Netherlands. So, well, I've sent you the question. So my first question before we start is: do you have any questions in advance?
Oh, yes, I always have questions, but I just wanted to appreciate you doing this interview and, uh, you know, spreading the word a little bit about our work and the experiential learning theory. The Netherlands has been like a source of a lot of people in the Netherlands, at least from my perspective, have been involved in experiential learning and made contributions to experiential learning. And actually, Scandinavia in general has, in Denmark, in Sweden, in Finland, there's been an unusual amount of interest and activity over the years there. So I'm always glad to talk with colleagues there.
Right. Well, as you saw, I made some sections, a personal life section. I want to talk, of course, about your book, which has inspired me, and education in general, especially education in the United States. Um, First of all, my first question is: how do you look back at your own school periods? Do you have fond memories? Do you have good memories?
Yes, for the most part. I I grew up in a small midwestern farm town, and most of my fellow students were not particularly interested in education. Whereas for some reason or another, I think partially because of my mother, I was uh, very interested in ideas and learning and everything like that. So I sort of stood out in that very small group, and I suffered a bit from it. My fellow students called me brain, and I was bullied a bit and everything like that. And but I played football and did those things, and it was a good experience. Um,
And when you think back of teachers who inspired you, is there anyone in particular who has inspired you to become who you are, or just inspired you in general?
oh yes, I think this is one of the reasons why I just consider teaching to be such a noble profession is because teachers can make such an incredible impact on students and learners, and rivaled only by one's parents, I think. But as I thought back on it, Timon, I remember my first experiential learning exercise in the sixth grade. And of course, at the time, I didn't know anything about experiential learning or anything like that. But my teacher, we were studying the United Nations, and my teacher organized the class. She did their heretical thing of having us sit around in a circle. And each one of us were given the assignment to pick a particular country and learn about that country and be the representative of that country in a United Nations forum. And so I picked Russia, and because that was the time this was the 1950s, and we were hiding under our desks and doing all kinds of things. And that experience, still sticks with me. 70 years later. So that I don't remember the teacher's name, but that experience, it's funny. I've gone back to that as something that stood out. I had a Latin teacher in high school. I was an absolutely terrible Latin learner, and my learning with language has never been good. But she was a disciplinarian, and just I just found her to be very inspiring in a kind of, not a sort of supportive way, but a kind of strict way. And the learning of Latin has been such a boon to me in my scholarly work through my life. It's really quite amazing, because it causes you to go in English. I don't know about in Dutch, but in English, it causes you to go back to the roots of the words and their meaning. Yeah. Anyway, so that was a big thing. But, maybe the biggest thing was in college, where I sort of wanted to major in, I wanted to be a minister, because I thought that was a good thing. But then I had, in the process, all kinds of difficulties with organized religion. And in particular, I reacted very strongly to the way the preacher in our church tried to indoctrinate me and made me repeat back, dogma. And there's something that just struck me as profoundly wrong about that. And so I had lots of doubts about organized religion, but still had this desire to help people, and psychology seemed like the place to do that. And so I started majoring in psychology with a minor in philosophy and religion. And for better or for worse, the psychology department was a behavioral psychology department. And in the 1960s, that means running rats in Skinner boxes. And I had a kind of assistantship or some kind of thing to earn money, where I cleaned rat cages and everything like that. And I just was going, what in the world does this have to do with anything?
Because that kind of science was related to human science. You were doing experiments on rats in order to understand human behavior, something like that.
Yes, that was absolutely what psychology was in the 1960s.
Wow.
B.F. Skinner
Yep.
was the preeminent person in that area, but it had been preceded by John Watson and a whole series of Clark Hall and so on. And that was the strongest tradition about learning in America. Ridiculous. And so I'm getting to the teacher, right?
Yeah.
So this was quite a disturbing experience for me. And I sort of got some nurturance by the philosophy and religion stuff I was doing. But then they hired a new professor from Harvard who had worked with David McClellan, named David Berlew. And he was a personality theorist like McClellan. And all of a sudden, this man was teaching me what I thought I had come into psychology for, about people, about individual differences, about the nature of who we are and personality and uh, all of these things. And he was a very inspiring man to me also. And so I just kind of imprinted on him as you do with the teacher that you love and who seems to care for you as a person. And we developed really a lifelong relationship. The big thing he did was he uh, introduced me to, he said, what are you going to do after you graduate? And I said, I don't know. He said, what about going to graduate school? And I said, being from a small town, what's that? And he said, well, you can get a PhD, and maybe you'd like to go to Harvard. And I said, where's that? So I was totally unaware of these things, but he managed to get me into Harvard.
All right.
With David A Kolb. And so, in terms of a pivotal teaching relationship, this man was huge in my life.
So he played an integral part in your life. In your book, you also talk about John Dewey, and he has my interest as well, because I think many of his ideas, although from a long time ago, still apply to education today. What was his influence on your work when you studied, when you majored? Did you know him back then, for example?
No, I'm not that old.
No, I mean, did you know his work, not personally?
Oh, okay, yeah, yeah. Well, I don't know, when did he die? Like in the 50s, early 50s, was it? Yeah, I mean,
Well,
I don't.
I can imagine it must be the early 50s. In May, I'm going to interview Noam Chomsky. Maybe you know his name.
Okay, yes.
And he's one of the persons who personally talked to him. So it must have been somewhere in the 50s.
Right. Yeah, I've known students of Dewey.
Ah, all
Before
right.
I get to that, Timon, I noticed that you're talking about the how you learn is how you live, and that's how you got connected through Kay Peterson
Yeah.
with me. Uh, the more educationally addressed book that Alice, my wife, and I did last year too is called The Experiential Educator.
Yes.
Are you familiar with that?
I know the title. I haven't read the book yet.
Yeah, so I would recommend that
Yeah.
highly to you, because I think I go into a lot of the questions that you were asking that, as you point out, were not really addressed in how you learn is how you live.
Exactly. That
Uh,
I was wondering why don't you talk about education in your book? It's not really about education in high school or primary school. It's more about school of life instead of high school and primary school. So, but you told what you're saying now is we published a book about education and these theories.
well, yes, and experiential learning theory. Uh, but I keep getting ahead of myself here. Uh,
Well,
so we can talk.
let's start from the beginning. So you majored in social psychology, and when did you come up with the idea? That's interesting for my readers as well. When did you design? When did it come into your mind for the first time? This experiential learning and learning styles. How did it
Right.
happen?
Yes. It's to me anyway, an interesting story. Actually, the idea of learning styles is kind of a secondary idea to the learning cycle and experiential learning as a process. Um, and I first got introduced to that through what was called sensitivity training, or T groups. Are you familiar with?
No.
Well, this is a group dynamics movement that was started by Kurt Lewin. in the 1940s. He actually had just left MIT when I went there in the 60s, and there was at MIT a number of his followers who had developed this method of group training called laboratory training, in which basically groups were self-analytical. They were trying to understand their own functioning in a process where the leader abdicated from the formal directive leadership mode into a sort of facilitator role and let the group do the work. And this was a profoundly experiential process for groups. It was a trauma to not have the leader, and so the group struggled and fought, and their personalities came out and so on. So that's where I first came in contact with Lewin's idea of experiential.
What year are we talking about?
Pardon me?
What year are we talking about? What
this
time
would
period?
have been, for me, in 1965 was when I went to MIT.
All right.
And so it would have been 67 or so that I went to this laboratory, 66 or 67. And in Lewin's work with the laboratory method, the way he would introduce a group to its purpose was to say, we're going to have experiences together as a group, reflectively contemplate those experiences together, and then try to make meaning out of those experiences and understand what it is happening in our group, and then to use that meaning to guide and direct our future experiences in the group. And so I always saw that as kind of a clever trick that the facilitator used to step out of the formal leadership role. However, on reflection after the experience, I began to think about, well, maybe that is a theory of learning in general. And what if you took that experiencing, reflecting, thinking, and acting cycle seriously as a theory of learning and applied that in educational endeavors? So that was the nub of the idea.
And what did it look like? Because now we're talking about 9 different styles.
Right.
What did it look like back in the 60s?
Well, it was the cycle that's in the book there, the 4 modes: experiencing, reflecting, thinking, and acting.
That hasn't changed over time?
No, it hasn't. And the only thing that's changed is we've tried to be more explicit about the idea that learning styles are not a single trait, but they are the way a person goes through the learning cycle. So a person's learning style is how you look at those 4 modes and what their preferences among those modes are.
Yes.
And therefore where they might get stuck because they like reflecting more than anything else,
And who invented the word learning style? Would that be you?
I think so. That may be a case of simultaneous invention, because there is another learning style that was created around that time, and who was first, I don't really know. And that was the, what is her name? I'm blocking on her name now.
What time period are we talking about?
But this would have been in the 60s, and her learning style is about students looking at, what the temperature in the room is, and should they like to learn when they eat or when they don't eat, and so on. But I created the term learning style well, just a little bit more of the story. Um, I took that idea of the learning cycle that I got from the T group, and we
Yes.
applied that in the course that I was teaching at MIT. And so we started by doing the groups with the management students, and that was just too emotionally stressful for them. It really freaked them out to have to not have a leader and all this kind of stuff. So we said, well, what if we took that learning model seriously and structured it a bit more by having experiences like a role play or whatever game or something like that, having a group reflect on that, having readings that interpret what that role play might mean, and then having them write an essay about how they would apply what they've learned from that in their life. And so that's kind of where we implemented and developed further the learning cycle. But in that process, we kind of discovered the idea of learning style. And by that, I mean, when I used to lecture with all my fancy ideas from Harvard to these students, it was a disaster, Timon.
Why?
uh,
What happened?
I mean, these people were not interested in psychology, and I taught them the way I had been taught in the psychology classes, and it just, as most lectures don't really work very well unless you're a great theatrical person or whatever. Uh, but what we discovered when we introduced the experiential learning method, there were a whole group of students who really loved that. Managers tend to be active and want to do things, and so it really fit them. But there were those students who actually, while they didn't particularly like my lectures, were comfortable with them and were very uncomfortable with the, uh, you know, doing a role play or something that was unclear what the meaning of it was, that in advance and so on. So we said, oh yeah, people do not understand what we're doing here about with this. They don't understand this learning cycle. So we said, uh, well, maybe we can create a simple test to make people understand their preferences for different parts of the cycle. And that little simple test was the beginning of the learning style inventory. And indeed, it did help students to better understand what the experiential learning process was and what was going on in the class and their own interest in it. So
So,
that's kind
so
of how the learning style developed out of
I
the
see.
learning cycle.
Well, one of the things that's happening in the Netherlands, and that has been happening, well, I think ever since, is that people doubt the viability, the science behind it. So you talked about the beginning of learning cycles. Um, was it a science already then? When is it something scientifically correct or scientifically proven? So everything you just described, are we talking about science yet?
Well, that's a good question. Is science one thing?
But that's, of course, defining
Um,
science is already difficult. But well,
um, like Lewin's idea about science was what he called action research. And he saw science as a cycle of iteration between theory and practice. So it's actually a learning cycle, isn't it? So you have a theoretical idea, you put it into practice, you see how it works, you improve it or change it or whatever, and so that to me is a very powerful, quote, scientific
Yeah.
approach. Uh,
Yeah, but we will come to the criticism later, because one of the things I noticed on your website, you really documented a lot of research, also criticism, and that's
right,
really that's
right,
science for me as well. Not just talking about your own findings, but
sure,
also about criticism, and that's really what I liked about
right,
your website. Also, criticism. So that's really good. I want to.
sure.
That's. We will come back to that later.
Okay, right.
So
So, just generally on your point about science, there's what you call the science of discovery, the experimental and the control group, and so on. And a lot of people are criticizing on the basis of, quote, science. That's their definition of science. But as you say, scholarship is also, quote, a science in a way, hermeneutic inquiry into the meaning of texts and so on. The qualitative research is also a science. So, at least in my mind, there are many different approaches.
yeah,
We'll come to that later.
exactly. So I want to move to the next section, and that's about education, especially in the United States, because that's your field of expertise. Um, so if you look at education in the United States today, how would you describe the current status of American education? What do you see?
Well, it's not a particularly pretty picture, is it? Um, Alice and I, who have been working together really since the the beginning of the century, and have developed a lot of the current research together, including the book The Experiential Educator. Uh, we're just recently in Singapore, which is, I think, rated the number one or number two educational system in the world. And uh, it's just amazing to see what they've done. Not because they're number one now, but they are dissatisfied with where they are being number one, because they realize that the criteria for being number one are totally weighted to the abstract. And so our visit to the Ministry of Education there was part of their effort to develop what they call a co-curricular curriculum to address what you mentioned in your questions, the 21st century skills and, citizenship and empathy and character and moral judgment and all of these things, which are better learned through experiential learning than they are through lecture or
Exactly.
whatever. So, that's a contrast that is really stark. And of course, we also were in Finland, like maybe, it's been a while back now, 1993, and worked where they have done amazing things with experiential learning. And you see in Finland teachers who are highly respected and paid commensurate with that respect. So it's those kinds of contrasts, Timon, that I bring to looking at education in the U.S. And you see us now with huge teacher strikes going on in multiple states because they are so poorly paid and schools are so severely underfunded. And the discrepancies between, the rich schools in the suburbs and the poor schools in the inner cities are just staggering. And we have an administration which is dedicated to building charter schools, which I don't really have anything against charter schools, except that they are thriving at the expense of the public schools, both in terms of taking away funding and also attracting students who, it's ruining the diversity of the public schools. So these are really serious problems.
Well, what always blows my mind when I think about American education, by now I have talked to quite some American scientists like Robert Mazzano, like Richard Ryan of the self-determination theory, and what I just don't understand is that there are so many brilliant scientists, educational scientists in the United States, and also your predecessors like John Dewey and Piaget and people like that. Um, but still, you don't manage to have the best educational system in the world. How come you have such a good educational science in the United States, and it doesn't work, and it doesn't is not applied into American education? How come? How do you explain that?
That's a really, yeah, uh, I think your observation is right. Uh, and I think a lot of it has to do with the structure of American education, where public schools are local and they're run by local school boards and funded by real estate tax for the most part. So the curriculum in schools tends to be dictated by local interests with a bias toward property owners, and so there's a kind of uh, incredible diversity uh, in American education, where there are phenomenal schools, unbelievably wonderful schools, and also, tons of really poor schools. And it's all this uh, kind of local control. Now, some people, Timon, it's interesting, say, well, that's why America has such a creative, diverse set of ideas, is that students are not brainwashed into a national curriculum where when the bell rings every 50 minutes they go to history or whatever and are taught the same thing throughout the system. I don't know if that's true or not, but
But believe me,
that's
the scientists I've talked to, they say the opposite. The fact that we don't have a national curriculum. I talked to Donald Hirsch. Maybe you know his name. He's 89 and he wrote the book Why Knowledge Matters. And he said we don't have a national curriculum and we're just investing in skills that we can't measure, and just the factual knowledge is not so important anymore these days. So what we need is a national curriculum. Robert Mazzano told me, he said we have a national curriculum, but nothing is done nationally. It just doesn't work. It's just too fractured.
right,
And
right.
you're basically saying the same thing.
Yes,
One of my
yeah.
questions ask, I ask you is, if you were in the shoes of Betsy DeVoe, what would be your first intervention to make American education great again? To talk in Trump's vocabulary.
Well, that's a really awful, awful thought.
Yeah. Well,
uh, Stripping the politics out of it. Um, I should just say very honestly, Timon, that I try very much in what I say, particularly in public like this, to stay within my lane as a researcher and scholar and student of learning and experiential learning in particular, and not try to develop opinions that really may not have much serious foundation outside of that. I've never been much of a marketer of my ideas or concerned about selling them. My main focus has always been on the creation of the ideas, making them as sound as I can. And once I've done that, I'm sort of on to the next thing.
Well, that's interesting.
So,
You say you're not really into marketing your theory, but still, it's applied worldwide. Companies know it, uh, societal organizations know it, schools know your theory. When you are in teacher training, learning styles are part of theory. So when did you publish your theory for the first time? Your learning styles theory and your learning cycle. When did it? When was your first major publication?
well, the book that is probably the most systematic statement was published in 1984, called Experiential Learning. Experience is the source of learning and
Yeah.
development. And I revised that in 2015. So that would be,
And what do you think? How because it wasn't you who spread it um, worldwide. How come it has reached so many people? What do you think?
well, for one thing, you asked me how I was influenced by John Dewey, but I was influenced by John Dewey and Kurt Lewin and Jean Piaget and Carl Jung and Carl Rogers and Mary Parker Follett and Lev Vygotsky. And so these are giants
The behaviorists, the
in the field
behaviorists.
of psychology and education that, as I looked at it, people had bypassed. And as you say, they weren't really being uh, 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 used to the extent that they should be in influencing the actual practice of education. So basically, it is a surprise to me too, because I just don't do marketing, but I think it's because I stole their ideas. I took their ideas and discovered in it that they were all talking about a similar thing, which was experiential learning theory. And in my own teaching, I've been a professor I'm emeritus now, but I was a professor for 45 years. And much of it was doing work with doctoral students and dissertations and things like that. And in that process, Tylen, there were uh, some people who saw these ideas, and I saw them just be transformed by these ideas and become so infatuated with them that they just, apply it in their life and so on. So I think it's the power of the idea. And I guess my philosophy has been, okay, produce the best idea you can, and sooner or later somebody will discover it. And if they don't, well, too bad for them.
And when did you first discover it had traveled around the world? When did you first
Yeah,
find out?
yeah. Well, this has been the most wonderful thing about my involvement with experiential learning. To have spent my whole career, basically, 50 years on one topic. How in the world could you do that? Um, but at a certain point, I began to get letters back then, and then when email started, the emails, and now it's just so great. Our website, we get daily questions from people and people doing research and so on. And there's nothing like having somebody be interested enough in your work to ask questions about it, even to criticize it, whatever. to stimulate your own inquiry and desire to answer those questions. It's like it completes a cycle in a way. You ask, I try to answer, and you ask, then you answer, and then it creates an ongoing conversation. And that's what I've been working on, is that ongoing conversation for years, and it just is never ending.
And where has it
Wonderful.
where has it brought you in the world?
Well, it
Literally,
brought me
where
to
have you been?
Hawaii.
Well, how did you end up in Hawaii?
Yeah. Uh, well, I think, yeah, how did I end up here? I just fell in love with the place. We live on the island of Molokai, which is 6,000 people, two-thirds of whom are native Hawaiians. Uh, and it's a farm community, all nature, surrounded by nature, which I find to be very spiritually enriching. And so, like for years, when I was here, I've been here since coming back and forth since 1980. But
For
like
holiday
after
purposes
the
or
90s, we got the internet and we got and Skype and all of this. So it's very easy from here to be in touch with people all over the world and
yes?
to have conversations like this. Wonderful.
So how long have you lived on Hawaii?
Um, well, I started in 1981 uh, for 2 weeks, and then that became a month, and then that became 3 months. And so now
I
my
see.
wife Alice and I are here full time.
The reason I'm asking, and one of my questions also is, uh, does Hawaii have an influence on your work as an author? Because sometimes when I'm reading about the finding your true self and grounding and feelings, it almost sounds a bit spiritual. Um, does
Yes.
Hawaii have an influence on your work?
Um, well, yes, I think so. I think uh, perhaps it will have more impact in the future than it does now because uh, I can see connections that way. Um, it is a spiritual place. The Polynesian culture uh, is a wonderful, the values of the Polynesian culture are really wonderful values. The spirit of aloha, the kind of gift cycle as opposed to the commodity cycle that governs exchange in the society of sharing and taking only what you need, and sustainability and all of these issues. As I say, these are things which I hope to address more in the future than I have maybe up to this point.
When we talk about your work in education, um, have there been schools, are there schools in the United States or maybe abroad that have applied your theory and really gained a lot from it as gains in maybe cognitive output as well? Because, of course, you need to pass your exams. So one of the things that's really controversial is you can't measure the output of learning styles. That's what people say. That's what the critics say. You can't say whether it was the learning styles or the influence of the teacher. So let me be more specific. Well, I was specific, I think. Have you done interventions in schools that have really shown amazing results?
Um, well, personally, I haven't done a lot. I'm aware of many studies that are listed in the bibliography that you talk about on our website that have done all different kinds of things. Uh, You know, I think that there aren't many studies that uh, kind of, well, take for example, probably the most prominent critique of learning style out there was Pashler's study uh, of where he said he criticized learning styles as not being effective and uh, looked at learning styles. He framed the question as learning style theory says that if you match the learning style to the teaching style, that should produce better results. Um, that's not the position of experiential learning theory. The position of experiential learning theory is teaching around the learning cycle so that people learn all of the different modes of the learning cycle as we describe it. How you learn is how you live. But nonetheless, they did a meta-analysis of all the studies that have looked at this matching hypothesis, and they found none of them had any results which met their standards of discovery research and sort of the gold standard of blind controlled research and so on. Actually, in a footnote, there was one study that did meet the standards, and that happened to use experiential learning theory. Which they somehow discounted that.
All right.
Which I never understood
what
why.
I read a lot
But
is, yeah, continue, please.
um, so the thing about that study was they lumped all learning style instruments together. And since I created the term in 1960 or whatever, 68, there are now, as far as I can tell, over 100 learning style instruments. And they are vary as widely as somebody scratching something on an envelope to, the Myers-Briggs, which is a hugely popular personality test, which has been relabeled the learning style test because that's the current buzzword or whatever. But all of those inventories are different than experiential learning idea of learning style as being how you go around the cycle. They tend to be a measure of, do you prefer to work alone or do you tend to work in groups and so on. It's unilinear thing. So
you can choose between um, two things: working alone, working together.
right,
Stuff
yeah.
like that.
So it's a there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that when they did this research, they clearly had not delved into the individual learning style instruments they looked at and the differences among them. So
When criticism is that there isn't a really clear framework, and what you describe is that there are many frameworks. That's maybe the problem. When you talk, for instance, about fixed mindset, a flexible mindset, a Carol Dweck's work, which you know, of course,
yes,
which you mention in your book as well. That's
absolutely.
easy. There's two mindsets: fixed mindset, flexible mindset. When you talk
Right.
about Deci and Ryan's self-determination theory, you have a couple of variables. That's it. When you talk about learning styles, there are over 100 learning styles. So it's really really difficult as a researcher as well to define a clear framework, clear standard.
Right.
So how do you explain to people? Where do you guide them? Where do you lead them if they want to find um, the correct framework in your eyes?
Um, well, I just try to explain what experiential learning styles are, uh, have them try it for themselves and see whether it makes any sense to them. I try as best I can. Alice and I, uh, Alice does most of this communication with our international network, where researchers, doctoral students, faculty, business people, are continuing to do research. Uh, so that it's it, it's kind of like, it's sort of the way it is in science. Like there's many different voices, and there are many different people who are attempting to establish their own career and their own expertise and their own visibility, and so they put their voice out there, and say theirs is the best, and I guess it's a marketplace of ideas.
Yeah. Um, I also posed a question that what research really stood out, really surprised you
What research about?
about learning styles, the outcome of the research that you was really surprised. Wow, it works, or wow, it really doesn't, or I didn't expect this to happen.
That's a good question. Uh, I think uh, one of the surprising things for me has been our research on learning flexibility, uh, and the idea that uh, learning style is not a fixed trait, but sort of a dynamic state of going around the cycle, and that people can develop the ability to change their style as a function of the situation, and to use all the learning modes to develop what we call full cycle learning.
Yeah.
And so to be able to develop a measure of that and validate a measure of that was gratifying and surprising, that it would actually work and relate to, for example, Levenger's ego development scale, so that people who are more flexible in their learning style are higher in their level of ego development in Levenger's scale, the integrated stage of her scale.
That's a thing that comes back with other theories as well. Last year I interviewed Robert Quinn, who designed the
Yes,
computing values framework.
right,
Also for education, he made a framework, and he said you can't just stick to one style. If you want to apply the competing values framework, you need all four quadrants of the framework. And
right,
criticism is that these frameworks um, produce a fixed mindset. They say, "Well, I have the imagining style, and that's it." And then you have a fixed
right,
mindset. But what you're saying, and what Robert Quinn is saying, and what other scientists are saying who designed similar theories, like human dynamics, for example, they say you need all parts of the cycle, all parts of the quadrant. So that's what really, well, it's what I see happening is that people who are critics say it creates a fixed mindset, but you never said that you have to stick to one style. You have to discover your style, and then
right.
that
So that
should.
was a really wonderful kind of reframing it, to be able to start to show that empirically was really good. Yeah.
And how do you deal with criticism? Because I noticed, I read a letter from the Washington Post where like 20 professors signed a letter and say, learning styles don't waste your time. We should do interventions that are scientifically proven. Do you know which letter I'm referring to?
No, I don't.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
Washington Post. When you Google learning styles, and then the first page is Wikipedia, like always, and then it has a reference to that letter in the Washington Post. You can find it there.
What is the date of that letter?
Uh, 2015, I think. It's
Uh-huh.
pretty recent.
Right.
So my question is, how do you deal with criticism? Does it affect you personally, or do you always look at it professionally, or maybe sometimes you think it's incorrect or injustice? How do you deal with criticism?
Well, uh, having spent my whole career in academia, uh, you are surrounded by it. Criticism is kind of a way of life in academia. That's the way academics get hold of anything, is they criticize it. So I suppose I've gotten used to it in that regard. In terms of experiential learning theory, I have to, for the most part, feel extremely grateful to my critics. Particularly in the early years with the learning style inventory, as I said, I created that uh, really as kind of an exercise for a class, not as a test. But it was only later I said, well, this has got some value, and started to develop it. Well, a lot of the early research on the early versions of the test was by critics who did their own research and said, well, the reliability is poor here, there's no test retest, and raised all of these issues of psychometrics, which were extremely helpful to me in improving the instruments, which we've done, I think, 6 times. So that kind of criticism is just absolutely wonderful, and there have been criticisms of the theory that have really seriously engaged with the theory and so on that are just absolutely terrific. So on the whole, that's how we get ahead, I guess, is by putting your stuff out there,
Yeah.
getting beat up for it, and then try to make it better. Uh, uh, there are critics that I find frustrating because they clearly have read a popular idea about experiential learning, uh, you know, and like have not in any way gone any further than that. And so when the scientists are saying, you know, I don't know who these Washington Post people who signed that is, how many of them have actually read in depth
No,
the research?
you can't tell. You can't tell. It's just signed
Yeah.
by a number of
Well,
professors.
I'll bet you, Timon, none of them. If there's 100 learning styles out there, or even the premier ones like what is it, VARC, visual,
Yeah.
auditory, kinesthetic, and reading,
That's the
or the
basics. Yes.
Myers-Briggs,
Yes.
or experiential learning,
Yeah.
or the surface versus
Yeah.
depth research, or uh,
Yeah, but that's
they're adopting a very restricted idea of what science is, and they're just assuming that nobody has done it, and case closed. So that's
I can tell you when we talk about learning styles in the Netherlands, 90% of time we talk about visual learning style, um, auditive, how do you say, listening, and kinesthetic as well. Nobody mentions these
right,
individual um, parts. Never. We never talk
right,
about this. We have a different framework. We say
right.
it doesn't work. Learning styles, visual and kinesthetic. It's bullshit. They say, but they never mention this framework.
Right, right.
So
So they're kind of lumping everything together. And actually, there is very good critical research about the VARC and its relationship to learning. If you go on YouTube, there's a guy who has a very convincing and has also written. I can't recall his name at the moment either. You know, that while it's true that people have preferences for processing visual and auditory, that doesn't seem to have anything to do with whether they learn or not. So it's a very complex and, I'd have to say, on the whole, pretty poor body of research. And it's very easy to look at something where there's a lot of bad research and saying the whole thing is not any good. And, you know, as someone who created all this before all that other stuff existed, it's a little bit painful saying, well, look at mine, you know. But
yeah, it must be impossible with all these people worldwide who have their own framework. Sometimes framework that don't relate to yours at all, and they say it doesn't work. So it's something we've got to live with, I suppose. Well, I've come to the final questions, and that's about your work today and in the future. But before I go there, you co-authored the book with Kay Peterson. I'm going to interview her in May because we are writing back and forth. So I was wondering how did it work writing a book together? What was her part in it, and how did it go, the cooperation?
Okay. Well, it was wonderful. And in fact, in my life, the best collaborations I've had, being somewhat of an analyzer myself, working with initiators and experiencers has been a real boon for me. It kind of helps me complete the cycle in my work, you know, as it would with anyone. Kay is someone who was one of these people who, when she came upon experiential learning, just transformed her life, and it became something she wanted to dedicate her life to. And so she's built the Institute for Experiential Learning, and we offer a certification program for experiential learning together, and it was wonderful.
Whose idea was it to write the book?
Right. It was actually her idea. My writing and my research has been journal articles and academic primarily. David Kolb, which is a wonderful publisher of popular books.
Robert Quinn published his book there as well.
Who did?
Robert Quinn.
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah, well, they're just, I have to say, I'm very impressed with them, but I have never attempted to write for, quote, the mass market or for individuals, but I feel that these ideas of learning are so important for individuals, and really individuals can read a book like that and it can really make a difference to them. And so Kay found the publisher, and she brings to it her own practical business applications, coaching. She's an excellent coach and uses experiential learning there. So it was a wonderful collaboration.
And the title? How did you come up with the title? Beautiful title.
You like the title?
Yeah, I like it. Yeah.
You know, we had another title, but our editor, Neil Mallet at David Kolb, came up with that title.
Oh, right.
And I thought it was brilliant.
What was the initial title then?
The Learning Way.
The Learning Way. That's mentioned in the book as well.
Yes, right, yeah. But he said that sounded too vague. It may be a little bit too spiritual.
Yeah. All right. Well, nice. Well, I sent Kay an invitation for an interview, and then she said, "Well, I think you should talk to David because he's the man who invented the learning cycle." I said, "Well, he's a scientist, and I really like to talk to people who put these ideas into practice as well." So I said,
Right.
okay, you're wrong there. I'm really interested in your vision as well, especially since you put all these ideas into practice. And I can imagine all these practical examples. Um, uh, well, I think it's really important that she co-authored as well. So I'm really
Oh, I'm
curious.
so glad you're doing that.
Yeah, and then she said, well, how about she said you have to talk to David, and I think it's best when I interviewed you about your experience in education. I said, well, that's good. You will interview me then, and I will interview you, 50-50. So we will have
Yeah,
that
good for her.
conversation in
Yeah.
May. So I'm looking.
Have her coach you to have her give you the learning style, the latest learning style with the flexibility, and have her coach you about
Yeah,
the cycle. You find that very
yeah.
interesting.
Well, she
Your
told me, have you
scores.
done the tests already? If not, I will send you a test. So I'm sure she will, and we're going to talk about my experience in classrooms, and I will publish it as well, and I will of course share the interview with you as well.
Oh,
So
great.
I'm coming to the end, and my last few questions. I have two or three. One is, what are you doing today with your theory, and what does the future look like? So let's start with today. What does your working day look like?
Oh, what does my working day look like?
Do you,
Oh, well.
well, you emeritus professor, right? So, um,
Yeah. So I work in the morning and the afternoon, for a couple hours each time. Alice and I begin our day like at 4:30 in the morning, and we go to a beach to walk it at sunrise. It's a 3 mile long beach, and so we make that walk
every
and
day,
do
every
every
day
day. Yeah.
at
Well, not
4:30.
every day. On the weekends, I work in the garden, but. Uh,
4:30. That's really
well, yeah, I mean, we get to the beach about 6:30 for the sunrise and so on. So,
wow,
and
wow.
we then do a Tai Chi routine together, and so that's how we start the day, and that's a absolutely wonderful way to reflect and
Wow.
meditate, be with nature, uh, uh, and so then I, come back, do things like this, work on papers, and we have, as I mentioned, this certification program, which is an online process for people who want to become certified in experiential learning theory. So we have sessions like that, and Alice and I work with uh, different students who have their different research projects and stuff like that. So that's kind of what we're doing.
So you still work on a full-time basis?
Well, but maybe not full time. I mean, you can't walk the beach for 3 hours. Call it full time, I guess, but uh, maybe 3 or 4 hours a
I
day.
see. Do you have any?
Doing what I like to do, Timon. That's the thing.
That's great. Well, do you have
When I
any?
was a professor, I ended up doing a lot of things I didn't like to do.
I see. Yeah. Well, and there's of course more than just the learning style inventory. I ask you about music and food as well. Do you listen to music, for example?
Yes, I've become quite. Actually, it's very interesting. Become immersed in Hawaiian music, and it's definitely an acquired taste. It's very distinctive music, and now when I listen to like mainland music and groups on the mainland, I find them to be not interesting to me anymore. They're kind of like very shallow and what they're talking about, whereas the Hawaiian music is very spiritual, very connected with nature and aloha. And,
It's always instantly recognizable. It always reminds me of stringed instruments with a slide or a beer
yes,
bottle
yeah,
or
exactly. Yeah, well, you're a guitarist, so you would
yeah,
understand about
yes,
slack key guitar,
yeah,
which is a very very popular
yeah.
mode here. So we, it's interesting. Uh, in the 70s here, there was an incredible revival in Hawaiian culture that was led by Hawaiian musicians. Uh,
in
so
on the
famous
mainland.
groups like Olamana and the Brothers Casimiro and so on, began to revive Hawaiian music and in the process the Hawaiian language. And so it was just like an incredible, exciting period in Hawaiian music, which has kind of passed a little ways now. And so we got Jamaican and kind of blends of different things, which are less appealing to me. But uh, we still, there's probably, well, I don't know, there's maybe more, but it seems like there's only about 100 Hawaiian music songs. So you hear the same songs over and over and over again, and the songs usually repeat the same words over and over and over again. So it's like watching the waves come in, just one
Yeah.
after another, and it's like this wonderful, peaceful.
Do you make music yourself?
No, I don't. That's one of the things which I'm
Um,
sorry about in my life. I wish I had.
yeah, well,
I envy people like you who are skilled with music.
yeah. Well, what's next for you? Your future? Are there any books on the way? Any projects abroad, or maybe working less?
Oh, I don't know. My future goes about as far as the end of my nose. I think I at the moment, Alice and I are working on a book on this educator role profile, which is about how to teach around the cycle, which we talk about some in the Experiential Educator, which I definitely recommend to you, by the way. And so, doing that in October, we're going to Australia, which is another place where experiential learning has is thriving, kind of like Australian wildlife, kind of isolated from everything else. So it's evolved in its own kind of way. So I haven't been there since I through the 70s and 80s. I was there regularly, and I haven't been there since the mid 80s. So it'd be interesting to go back and be there for a while. So that kind of
Yeah.
stuff.
So, what would you recommend if somebody who's reading about your theory? Where do you start from scratch? From scratch, if you're a teacher and you want to learn everything there is about the learning cycle, learning styles, the way you invented it, the way you meant it.
Right.
Where do you start as a teacher?
Well, I would say the Experiential Educator would be the book to read because it's the freshest. We've included all of our latest research on things like learning identity and stuff, which is related to Dweck's mindset stuff, and so it's and also about how the instrument was created, and so I think that's the best
All
reference
right,
at the
and
moment.
your website, of course,
Pardon me?
and your website, of course, because I find
Oh,
it.
well, then the other thing you could do is go to the
Yeah,
website, and there are resources there, free tests.
yeah,
You can
yeah,
take the educator role profile
yeah.
uh, and all kinds of papers so that may appeal to people. So
Have you worked
learningfromexperience.com, right?
learningfromexperience.com? I'll remember. Have you worked together with Carol Dweck?
No,
Because
I haven't. I
okay,
just
because
really am impressed by her work.
yeah, me too.
Uh,
Yeah.
there's a recent review that just came out, a meta-cognitive, or what, not meta-analysis of her research on her methods, which say it doesn't work.
Oh,
So there are people who make their careers out of saying things don't work.
yeah, it's
So
true. My last question, David, is if you would be in my shoes, if you had to interview anyone that inspires you today, or maybe in the past as well, but then you have to mention someone today as well. Who would that be? Who would you interview?
oh my goodness, they have to be alive.
Well, no,
Did you say They
Well, you
somebody who's alive today.
in your book you already mentioned your heroes from the
Right,
past, like
right,
Piaget, Vygotsky,
right,
Skinner, and
right.
stuff. So that's pretty obvious. But
Somebody today, huh?
somebody today,
Interesting.
who inspires you? It doesn't have to be a cognitive scientist or can be an artist.
Right. No, well, I was thinking of Barack Obama or maybe Michelle Obama. Uh,
And
the
what
certain,
inspires you about them?
um, just the tremendous character they have, and the equanimity they had, and the difficulty they had of not having white skin and being in the White House, and how well they handled that, and particularly in contrast to what we're going through now, uh, it would be, and also the way he's handled himself since he left office, he's a very impressive man. And Michelle Obama is also a very impressive woman. So I don't know about an interview, but to have dinner with them would be a real treat.
Hmm. And I was wondering about if we go to the scientific world, who is continuing your work when you're finished doing what you do? Who's next?
Oh, there are many people who are doing experiential learning work all over the world, and many former students. Uh, Chris Case, who's the chairman of the business department at George Washington University. Mai Trin, who is at Arizona State University. Angela Passarelli, who's at College of Charleston. Uh, there are just many.
I see.
Now, I haven't mentioned a lot of other people, which is always a problem with starting with names, but so there are many, many people who, whether they continue to contribute to experiential learning or whatever, they're very talented people and will find productive ways to express themselves, I'm sure.
Well, that was my last question. So there's nothing left just to say a lot of things. Thank you for your time, and also on behalf of my readers and of the many people who have applied your theory, and there are many in the Netherlands. Maybe not the same framework, but at least everybody is thinking about learning styles, and you have contributed to the discussion a great deal. Whether we're talking about the framework or not, we are talking about learning, about really
Yes,
looking at our students, about looking at our own
right.
lives. So whether it's
Recognizing them as
scientifically
individuals.
proven, my personal opinion is that science isn't always the answer to a certain way of living, and sometimes it's just good to be in class and notice that your teacher is really trying to do the best she or he can for you in order to flourish, whether it's scientifically proven or not. And let's be honest, many ideas in education aren't scientifically proven, but they are politically based. They don't have a scientific basis, and we have many interventions from politics, and we don't complain about that. We accept that, but as soon as we talk about learning styles, suddenly we need to scientifically prove everything. So I think that's not honest to say everything has to be scientifically proven. So I think, and that's my conclusion, it's always good to talk about learning styles, science or no science, to see your students, to see yourself. So um, from my heart, I really like to thank you for starting this discussion already in the 80s. Um, so it was an honor. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
So nice to talk to you too, Time, and thanks again for doing this.
Great. And for my article, I was wondering, do you maybe have a photo which I can use for my written
Sure.
article? So if you would be so kind to send me a press photo which I can use, that would be great. And as soon as I've published the article in Dutch, I will send you a copy.
Yeah, so can I get the video of the
Yeah, yeah, of course. Yeah.
That would
I,
be great.
I will send it to you. So, have a great day and a nice
Thank you.
walk on the beach. Send
Yeah.
my regards to your lovely wife, and I hope you can do what you do for many more years with well, all the passion you have in you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and see you.
Aloha.
Aloha.